name was Quintus Horatus Flaccus, though most refer to him today as Horace. Have you ever heard of carpe diem and the golden mean? These things are concepts of Horace. He was born in Venosa, Italy in 65 BC, so he was definitely a member of the ancient world. He passed away in 8 BCE in Rome. Horace was a poet and satirist who wrote under the Emperor Augustus Octavian, and whose works include the Odes, the Satires, and the Epistles. Horace was friends with the poet Virgil and was highly inspired by his works, especially the Aeneid. His friendship with Virgil included a bond with Maecenas, who was Virgil's patron and Octavian's right-hand man. Maecenas was the one to gift Horace with the Sabine farms, which is referenced and mentioned within the epistles. So Horace is a significant individual because he gives historians and classic geeks a peek into the environment of his day-to-day life and would influence poets and politicians, leaders, and writers for decades to come. We chose the epistles because although they are slightly less famous than the odes, they give an audience a glimpse into the social life, cultural, and political climate during the 1st century BCE. Due to this, the epistles are definitely worth reading and providing commentary on to increase accessibility and to increase the access to this extremely classical time.
So the tradition of writing commentaries actually extends back to the Alexandrian period, and we still have classical commentaries on Horace today. The practice itself has persisted consistently in various forms throughout history. For example, the reason we've been able to retain classical texts until now at all is the work of scribes, largely in monasteries, who created manuscripts of these works. However, the manuscripts didn't just reproduce the texts themselves, but also often contained marginalia, which are these annotations either by the original scribe or later readers, providing notes and explanations within the margins. In this 10th century Swiss Caroline manuscript of Horace's first ode, we can see an annotation with a symbol above it called a tie mark, which connects the word that's being explained to the accompanying note, glossing the identity of Attalus, who's a historical figure that readers might not be familiar with. And this entire page is full of such notes, which you can see surrounding the main body of the poem. And these annotations allowed readers to understand the context and content of the works at hand on a deeper level. Our project is to create a sort of modern set of marginalia by creating notes to accompany Horace's epistles. On a broader scale, the goal of this project is to make the epistles more accessible in 2 ways. First, our commentaries will provide the contextual, syntactical, and literary framework necessary for intermediate level Latin students to be able to read and understand them. And Horace himself referred to himself as a schoolboy's poet, that is, one who young people would be assigned to read during their education. So it's fitting that we would give his work this treatment. Additionally, we're going to make these commentaries freely available to the public. Currently, there are no free open source commentaries of the epistles available online. And so we hope to use our platform to make these works open to a wider audience of readers by removing the barrier created by the current necessity of buying a physical copy of a commentary. And in fact, we've already succeeded in this goal in part because a class at Brown University plans to use these commentaries in the upcoming semester.
Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of the detail about how the process we use to actually write these commentaries. So what we did was we basically broke them up individually. So for some of the shorter ones, one person would take them. For some of the longer ones, we broke them up by lines and multiple people took them. And the first thing we had to do was obviously translate the Latin into English. So we had our own translation to go up to make the commentaries off of. And then we would go back, you had to go back in and figure out, okay, what would be a helpful note on this line to someone who's an intermediate Latin student. And that was actually a fairly challenging aspect because you had to put yourself into the mind of someone who's not yourself. And that's where it really helped having other group members and Professor T who you could look to and say, okay, I typed this up. What do you guys think? Would this have made sense to you when you were at this level of Latin? So I think that was a really helpful thing and finding a sense of balance and writing something that was both helpful without being over informative and giving much useless information that wasn't really needed. And you can see an example of one of the commentaries here on the right. This was the one I did, which was Epistle 1.9. And one of the challenges I actually had in writing this was it was a lot more straightforward than some of the other poems, because this one is actually just a letter of recommendation that Horace wrote. It's very short, very to the point. There's not many philosophical things going on. He's just writing about another guy to who would become the Emperor Tiberius. So.
All right, so what makes a strong lemma? So a lemma is just a note for a specific line or word in a commentary, and the commentary is built out of a series of lemma. So as Emma noted before, Horace, known as like a schoolboy's poet, was extremely intricate. There's something interesting either grammatically, literarily, intertextually going on in almost every word in these poems. And so it behooves his commentator to give a similar level of scrutiny to each line. So this note here for verse 3 in episode 113, which is the one I did the commentary to, is the most common sort that you'd see, in that it's almost entirely structural and grammatical. So it points out a rhetorical construction, a tricolon crescens, which is a similar clause, in this case introduced by the word si, Latin for if, which, with the clause increasing one syllable each time, which is a rhetorical construction that would have been recognized to those trained in rhetoric in Rome. It also references a grammatical construction, a future more vivid conditional, meaning if this happens, then X will almost certainly happen. And as with almost every grammatical note that we put in the commentary, we have a hyperlink to the Allen and Greenough Latin grammar, which is the standard Latin grammar used in pretty much every classics department in the English world. So this next note is one that's slightly more contextual. It's for verse 17 of the same poem, which reads, Carminaque posint oculos orisque morari. So this line, like every line in Horace's poetry, is written in dactylic hexameter, which is a poetic meter consisting of 6 feet, containing either dactyls, a long syllable followed by 2 short syllables, as in carmina, or a spondy, 2 long syllables in a row, quae pos. So the line itself is actually referring to Horace reading his poems to Augustus, and then kind of transfixing his eyes and ears. So for this note, we referenced that is the general importance of meter and melody to all the classical poets, and also referenced the specific metrical construction of this line, alternating dactyls and spondies, which are very symmetrical. It's a very almost kind of hypnotic construction, which greatly fits the content of the line. And so this last note is one that we describe as epistemological, kind of just getting down to the actual meaning of the poem. It's a kind of note that you would see in a poem written in English, where even if you know all the words, there's something else that you might not get. So this note describes a joke Horace makes, kind of teasing his page, Vinius Asina, and comparing him for his poor work ethic and kind of sluggish demeanor to an Asinus, a donkey. So here we see what pretty much anyone today would recognize as a pun, Asina, Asinus, and based on something we can very easily understand, referring to a sluggish, lazy person as a donkey. So as Emma mentioned before, one of our main goals is to make these works accessible and recognizable to a modern audience, to show that everything written 2,000 years ago is not just completely arcane and dry and boring, and to show that even 2,000 years ago, an author like Horace is making jokes that are very recognizable to a modern audience.
So one of the last things that we're going to look at today is a little bit into the process of writing one of these lemmas. So we've already looked at that a lot, and you've seen some examples of how that's done. So this Latin that you see here is from Epistle 116, which is one that I worked on very closely along with Emma Glenn. So the Latin of this reads, in that meter that Elliot just told us about, which you can see diagrammed here. Cautus enim metuit foeam lupus accipiterqua suspectos laqueos et opertum millus hamum. And you have the translation there as well. So something that I noticed when I was translating this line is that the words accipiter and milwis, which are commonly used to refer to hawk and kite as the birds respectively, can also be used to specifically refer to the species of fish, the flying gurnard. And this doesn't seem like something that would be a big deal, but when I was checking the definitions of these words and I noticed that, I started to think, okay, how am I going to be able to determine if these words here are being used to mean the fish or the bird? And they're much more commonly used to refer to the bird, so it would have been easy to sort of write it off. But then as I was going through the line and you get to this word hamum, which is translated as hook, I realized that one of these words, the milwus, which is usually kite, had to be referring to the flying gurnard. And so I started to wonder, why would the Romans use these words that are already assigned to this bird species to also refer to this fish? And it's because the flying gurnard that you get is this flying fish. And so the Romans probably would have seen it looking like it has wings jumping out of the water and would have sort of said like, oh, it's a sea hawk or a sea kite. And that's where you get these words accipiter and milwus to refer to the bird species or to the fish species. But that was just something that I found really cool, that obviously Horace is using these two words that have this specific shared connotation to sort of play a trick on his readers and say, hey, I'm going to use both of these words, and one of them is definitely going to mean bird, but one of them might mean fish, and you sort of have to puzzle that out for yourself using the complete context of the poem. The last thing that we're going to look at today is we're actually going to go visit our website where all of these commentaries will be posted. So if this will load. So here you see over here on the sidebar, we have all of these epistles. I'm going to go to epistle 1-2, which is the first one that we all worked on together. And you can see that each of the poems has this introductory paragraph to go along with it before you actually get into the Latin text and the commentary. So these introductory paragraphs give an sort of background information on the historical context of the poem or any notable figures who might be mentioned, as well as referencing other literary theory and academic texts that could provide additional information about the poem. And you can click on and you can go to the actual Latin text. We have an accompanying image of a manuscript, which are what Emma was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. And you get into the actual Latin, and over here on the side, you have our commentary that we wrote. And as Elliot was talking about, we have hyperlinks inserted throughout to Ellen and Greeno, which is a grammar dictionary. We have links to maps for specific cities so that you can actually put these into a physical location instead of just hearing them sort of floating out in the world. And also certain notable figures who are mentioned throughout the text. We have links to Wikipedia entries, Britannica entries, that sort of thing, so that you can just get a sort of rudimentary understanding of who these people were that we're talking about. And with that, I believe that concludes our presentation. Thank you for your time and attention, and we really hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And so now we're going to open up the floor to questions. So you can either unmute yourself or you can post your questions in the chat.
I'll ask a question. I feel like I shouldn't. I wanted to ask you guys, maybe, you don't all have to answer, but maybe one or two representative examples of, what aspect of the commentary writing was most surprising for you? What did you think that you maybe wouldn't have to take into consideration, but you did? Or what aspects really were kind of inspiring to you?
So for me personally, I feel like when I read a Latin text in the original Latin language, usually I have a deeper sense of what each individual word means and maybe more a sense of the author's specific intent. But when I read poems in translation, because I'm more familiar with the language, it's much easier to get a sense of the literary intention behind it and maybe the sort of techniques used in that way. But through writing this commentary and having to examine the choice of each word and think about how I would try to explain it to another person, I felt like I was really able to get the same understanding of the poetry as I would have if I'd been reading poetry in English. And so I think it really sort of opened up a new way of examining and really taking in a poem written in another language that I hadn't encountered before.
And I think sort of going off of that, something that I ran into a lot is this idea that you can read a line and you can look at all of the words in the Latin. And I think there were several times where I said this to you, Professor T, that I would be struggling with a line because I would be looking at it and I would be like, I know all of these words and I know what all of them mean, but when they're all put together like this, I have no idea what's actually being said. And even there are times when in the Latin, I could explain to you what it meant and what was going on in the line, but putting it into English in a way that makes sense, either grammatically or contextually, can be really difficult.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. And to add on to it a little bit, one of the things I took away most was just, it gave me a deeper sense of not translating just for the sake of translating. Like, you really have to go back in more than one or two times to find those small little details of like, oh, this is a pun, or oh, this is a metaphor that I might not have picked up on if I was just translating this to just translate it.
So we also have a question from the chat that is, how much language study and history did students have going into this project?
A vast range of different, we're all at completely different places, I think, in our language study, which is something that I think is really cool. And it makes it a lot easier to kind of learn from each other and build off of each other as we're all at these varying stages of our study. And I think that makes it really enriching to work together.
I think it's beneficial for the commentary too, that you guys have different, because one will say, oh, I don't know who that person is, whereas others might know. And sometimes, like Colin was saying in his explanation about how, that's part of the joy of doing that group work, is that people, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I would definitely say I'm extremely at a beginner level of Latin. But despite that, I felt like I was able to get a really good grasp of the concepts of the poems. And when I was paired with another member of our group, Corinne, I felt like in a way that also just helps me increase my classics connections, because we were emailing back and forth, messaging like, is this right? Do you know if this is present, passive, help? And I just feel like also with other people asking questions, it helped me look at things in ways that I wouldn't have looked at it if I was just translating it for myself.
Okay, and with that, I think we're out of time for questions. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for this amazing presentation. It was really amazing to hear your work. So yeah, and we hope to see you at more junior practicum presentations.